I knew I was screwed the moment Scott Anderson called regulatory affairs legacy bureaucracy and smirked like he'd just solved world hunger with a PowerPoint slide. But that wasn't even the worst part. The real kick in the gut came 30 minutes later when I found my termination notice sitting on top of my turkey sandwich in the break room fridge. Still cold. My severance package was colder. That's me, Michael Thompson, 47 years old, divorced once, and until about an hour ago, Senior Regulatory Affairs Director at Pharmatech Innovations. I'd been grinding it out at this biotech company for 11 years, long enough to see 4 CEOs, 3 corporate makeovers, and enough compliance audits to choke a federal inspector. My job wasn't sexy, but it kept the lights on and the FDA happy. You know all that cutting-edge drug development that gets investors throwing money around like confetti? Yeah, none of that magic happens unless someone quietly, methodically keeps all the federal filings, state licenses, and international submissions running like a Swiss watch. That someone was me, the guy in the corner office who nobody noticed until things went sideways. But before I get into the mess that followed, let me paint you a picture of how an old Army logistics guy like me could unleash the kind of bureaucratic hell that makes grown executives cry into their craft beer. Picture this. Middle of Q2, Pharmatech flying high with a $35 million valuation. We've got 2 promising compounds in phase 2 trials, fresh venture capital money dangling like a carrot, and our CEO Timothy Davis quoting our market potential like it's tattooed on his business cards. And there I was, quietly renewing our FDA drug establishment registration before the December deadline, same as I'd done every year since 2012. Didn't ask for applause. Didn't even ask for a working printer that didn't jam every 3rd page. I just did my job. The company had been my second career after 8 years in the Army. Logistics coordination for medical supplies taught me that details matter, that shortcuts kill people, and that bureaucracy exists for reasons civilians never bother to understand. When I transitioned out at 36, biotech felt like a natural fit. Same attention to detail, same life or death consequences, just different uniforms and better coffee. 11 years later, I had my system down to a science. FDA submissions filed 30 days before deadline. State licensing renewals tracked on a spreadsheet that looked like a military operations board. International regulatory correspondence handled with the kind of precision my old drill sergeant would have approved of. I wasn't the smartest guy in the building, but I was the most reliable, and in regulatory affairs, reliable beats brilliant every single time. My son Jake was finishing his junior year at State, studying engineering like his old man always wanted to be. We talked every Sunday, usually about trucks, sometimes about girls, occasionally about the kind of career advice only a divorced dad can give. He was proud of what I did, even if he didn't fully understand it. You're like the safety guy, right, Dad? Making sure nobody gets poisoned by mistake? Close enough, kid. Then Scott Anderson showed up like a hurricane wearing designer jeans. Scott Anderson, 29 years old, VP of Digital Transformation, which is corporate speak for make everything complicated sound simple and fire people who know better. Fresh from some fintech startup where he'd probably disrupted parking meters or revolutionized food delivery apps. All energy drinks and buzzwords, talked about disrupting pharma workflows and called team meetings innovation huddles. Real Silicon Valley nonsense that made me want to hide in my office and pretend the internet never happened. Within 2 weeks, he'd reorganized half the departments, outsourced our IT support to some cloud-based service that went down every Tuesday, and replaced the monthly safety meeting with something called risk reimagining sessions. The man actually used air quotes when he said traditional approaches and had never seen an FDA inspector turn a company inside out looking for documentation that didn't exist. The first time he looked at me, he blinked like I was part of the office furniture that came with his promotion. "Remind me what you do again?" he asked on a Wednesday. I remember because that's the day our coffee machine finally gave up and died, and I nearly cried over instant coffee from the vending machine. FDA submissions, state licensing renewals, international regulatory compliance, basically everything that touches federal oversight, I told him, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. He nodded like I'd just explained how to tie his shoes. Right, the compliance stuff. Important work. The way he said important work made it sound like he was talking to a janitor about mopping floors. By Friday, he'd decided my position was redundant. Overhead. No warning, no discussion about transition plans, no questions about the dozen active filings sitting on my desk. Just a calendar invite titled Quick Chat and a stone-faced HR rep clutching an envelope with my name spelled wrong, Michael Thompson instead of Thompson. The meeting lasted exactly 7 minutes. Scott sat behind his new standing desk, bouncing slightly on his heels like he was warming up for a marathon. Michael, he said like we were old fishing buddies instead of two people who'd exchanged maybe 50 words total. First off, thanks for everything. Really. I looked at your file. 11 years, that's serious commitment. I nodded, waiting for the axe. That said, he continued, leaning against his desk like a motivational speaker getting ready to change my life. We're restructuring. Regulatory is being absorbed into legal. We're going lean, cutting redundancy. It's not personal, just math. I stared at him. Just stared. My heart didn't race. My throat didn't close up. I'd been through worse conversations in the Army when they told us our deployment was getting extended. Again. Understood, I said. What I didn't say, your ignorance is about to cost this company everything it's built. He smiled like we'd just agreed on lunch plans. Great. HR has your package. Clean transition, no drama. I'm sure you'll land on your feet. I stood up, shook his hand because my mother raised me right, and walked out of that office knowing exactly what I was going to do. Not revenge. I'm not that petty. Just precision. The kind of attention to detail that separates professionals from amateurs. I was out of the building by lunch, my F-150 loaded with a cardboard box containing a coffee mug from my Army days, a stress ball shaped like a pill bottle, and 11 years of institutional knowledge that Scott Anderson had just decided was redundant overhead. Little did he know, he'd just fired the only person in the company who understood that. Regulatory compliance isn't paperwork. It's a house of cards built on federal relationships, and he was about to find out what happens when you pull out the wrong card. But here's the thing about being a regulatory guy for 11 years, especially one with military training. You learn that precision matters. You learn that every form, every signature, every filing has consequences that ripple through the system like dominoes falling in slow motion. So before I walked out that door for the last time, I did one final thing. Not sabotage, not revenge, just accuracy with a capital A. I sat down at my desk, opened up our FDA Drug Establishment Registration Renewal, due in 8 days. The authorized official line still had my name typed in basic times, New Roman, Michael Thompson, Senior Regulatory Affairs Director. I stared at that screen for a full minute, thinking about all the late nights I'd spent making sure every comma was in the right place, every signature properly notarized, every deadline met with military precision. Then I clicked edit, deleted my name, and typed in Scott Anderson, VP of Digital Transformation. I didn't forge anything, didn't hide anything, didn't touch the verification requirements or the supporting documentation that would need to be submitted. That wasn't my job anymore, it was his. I just updated the contact information to reflect the new organizational structure exactly like any responsible employee would do during a transition. I hit save, downloaded the confirmation receipt, and logged out of the system for the last time. The beauty of regulatory compliance is that it's all about following the rules, and the rules said that when an authorized official changes, the new official has exactly 15 days to submit verification documents, background check results, professional references, and a notarized letter of authority to 6 different federal agencies. The rules also said that failure to complete this process would result in immediate suspension of all related registrations and a mandatory compliance review that could take months to resolve. Scott Anderson, VP of Digital Transformation, had no idea these rules existed. I packed up my personal items, coffee mug, family photo, the little American flag my son gave me when I retired from the Army, and walked past Scott's office one last time. Through the glass walls, I could see him on a video call, gesticulating wildly about synergistic optimization or some other Silicon Valley nonsense. He looked so confident, so sure that his disruptive innovation was exactly what this old-fashioned biotech company needed. I dropped my badge off with Carol Phillips at reception. She'd been there almost as long as me, watched 3 different waves of transformational leadership come and go. "You were always one of the good ones, Michael," she said quietly, sliding my badge into a drawer like she was filing away a piece of company history. "Thanks, Carol. Take care of yourself." Outside, December fog was rolling in from the bay, wrapping the Pharmatech campus in gray wool. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't flip off the building or key Scott's Tesla in the parking lot. I just climbed into my F-150, turned on some classic rock, and drove home through the fog, knowing that the paperwork I'd left behind was about to teach everyone involved a very expensive lesson about the difference between innovation and institutional knowledge. The first ping came Monday morning at 9:23 a.m., exactly 72 hours after I'd updated that form. FDA portal, automated message. Registration discrepancy detected. Authorized official change requires verification, documentation within 12 days of submission. Nothing catastrophic yet, just a gentle digital cough from the federal bureaucracy. I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee out of my Army mug and reading the sports section when my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Adams, my old contact at our regulatory consulting firm. "Hey Michael, heard you left Pharmatech, everything okay? Also, we're getting some weird calls about verification documents." I texted back, "All good, career change time. Can't help with the verification stuff, not my circus anymore." She sent back a thinking emoji and got it. Good luck with whatever's next. I put the phone down and went back to my coffee. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't worried about filing deadlines, compliance reviews, or federal inspections. Someone else could handle the paperwork. Someone else could explain to Scott Anderson why his title change had just triggered a regulatory avalanche. By Tuesday, the dominoes were really starting to fall. MedTech Associates, our biggest clinical trial partner, sent a formal notice to Pharmatech's legal department. Regulatory documentation inconsistency detected in FDA records. Clinical trial enrollment suspended pending verification of authorized representation. Translation, we're not risking our federal licenses because your paperwork looks like it was filled out by someone who learned regulatory compliance from YouTube videos. My phone started buzzing that afternoon. First Brian Richardson from legal, then Kevin Martinez from finance, then 3 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. This wasn't my problem to solve anymore. I was just a private citizen with 11 years of experience in regulatory affairs, currently between opportunities and enjoying the freedom that comes with not being responsible for other people's mistakes. Wednesday brought the second notice, and this one was copied to CEO Timothy Davis, who was apparently somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, flying back from investor meetings in London. Clinical operations paused pending clarification of authorized representation with federal regulatory bodies. Immediate response required. Scott Anderson, still riding the high of his own efficiency, held an emergency meeting to address what he called minor administrative friction, according to my former colleague Sarah Williams in Quality Assurance, who texted me updates because she thought the whole thing was hilarious. Scott bounced around the conference room like a caffeinated motivational speaker, assuring everyone that he was syncing with legal and that it was just back-end bureaucracy that would sort itself out. "It's all handled," he apparently said, tossing a stress ball against the wall. "Just some legacy system confusion. I'm interfacing with the regulatory ecosystem. Zero stress, people." Nobody looked convinced, especially not Brian Richardson, who by then had pulled up the FDA portal and discovered that 0 verification documents had been submitted by Scott or anyone else. That's when the smart money started asking the uncomfortable questions. Wasn't Michael the registered official for all our federal filings? Did anyone see him train a replacement? Why would he transfer everything to Scott without completing the paperwork? But Scott kept bouncing that stress ball, kept talking about streamlined processes and regulatory optimization, kept believing that confidence could substitute for competence. He scheduled an all-hands meeting to address transparency around workflow improvements and started using words like compliance architecture and regulatory synergy. He had no idea that 400 miles away, I was working on a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse and waiting for the federal government to explain the facts of life to a 29-year-old VP who thought bureaucracy was just another startup problem waiting to be disrupted. The storm was building, and Scott Anderson was standing right in its path, holding nothing but a stress ball and a PowerPoint presentation about digital transformation. Thursday evening, 8:45 p.m. Pharmatech's emergency board call looked like a crime scene filmed in HD, all ring lights and raw panic. I wasn't on the call, obviously, but Sarah Williams sent me updates in real time because she thought I deserved to watch the fireworks from the cheap seats. CFO Kevin Martinez was apparently sweating so hard his webcam kept fogging up. He kept loosening his tie like it was a noose, getting tighter with every question from the investors. And the questions, man, they were surgical strikes wrapped in corporate politeness. What exactly do you mean by regulatory suspension? How long has our FDA status been unclear? Why weren't we notified about the trial freeze until our clinical partner sent an alert? But the line that finally sent Kevin into full cardiac arrest mode came from Jason Williams, our biggest investor, whose fund had just dropped another $3 million into the Series B round 6 weeks earlier. "We can't maintain a $35 million valuation," he said slowly, clearly, like a judge reading a death sentence, "if your intellectual property is frozen across multiple federal jurisdictions. That's not an asset, that's a liability with a lab coat and a fancy PowerPoint deck." Dead silence. The kind of silence that costs money. Kevin apparently stammered something about temporary administrative realignment and federal processing delays, which, to be fair, is one hell of a euphemism for we let a 29-year-old disrupt our regulatory compliance like he was debugging a smartphone app. General Counsel Brian Richardson, the only guy in the room with more anxiety than ego, was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. While Kevin tap-danced around the truth, Brian shared his screen and methodically pulled up every federal filing for our 2 main compounds. One by one, he clicked through the digital forms. FDA Drug Establishment Registration, DEA, schedule listings, EPA chemical reporting requirements. Each one showed the same story. Change of authorized official submitted December 15th. New official, Scott Anderson. Verification status, outstanding. Compliance deadline, December 30th, days remaining, 3. Brian didn't say anything for a long moment, just clicked through page after page of federal bureaucracy, his face getting paler with each screen. Finally, this doesn't make any sense. Michael Thompson always filed verification documents the same day as any official changes. Always. 11 years, never missed a deadline, never left anything incomplete. More silence. Expensive, heavy silence. He clicked back to the main FDA registration. There it was, digital DNA spelling out exactly what had happened. Previous authorized official, Michael Thompson, Senior Regulatory Affairs Director. Updated official, Scott Anderson, VP Digital Transformation. Change submitted, December 15th, 2024. Verification documentation, pending. Brian leaned forward, rubbed his temples, and whispered, not to the camera, not to anyone specific, just out loud. Why would Michael transfer everything to Scott and then not submit the verification paperwork? He knows better than anyone what happens when you leave federal filings incomplete. Someone on the call, maybe a board member, maybe the ghost of regulatory compliance past, said exactly what everyone was thinking, unless he didn't want to submit it. What does that mean? Kevin asked, though his voice suggested he already knew and was hoping he was wrong. It means, Brian said carefully, that Michael Thompson did exactly what he was supposed to do. He transferred official responsibility to Scott Anderson accurately and legally. But he didn't complete Scott's verification process because that wasn't his job anymore. That was Scott's job. And Scott didn't know the job existed. The words hung in the digital air like smoke from a building that was already burned to the ground. Now, it wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about the difference between disruption and destruction, between innovation and institutional knowledge, between a 29-year-old VP who thought he could Google his way through federal compliance and a 47-year-old Army veteran who'd spent 11 years building relationships with regulatory agencies. Brian opened a search window, typed Scott Anderson plus FDA compliance training. Nothing. Scott Anderson plus regulatory transition. Nothing. Scott Anderson plus federal verification process. 0 results. Then he pulled up Scott's personnel file, his background check, his resume. Bachelor's degree in business administration. MBA from a decent program. 5 years at 2 different fintech startups. 3 years at a logistics software company. 0 regulatory experience. 0 federal compliance background. 0 understanding that being named as an authorized official meant you had to prove to 6 different federal agencies that you were qualified to hold that authority. Jesus Christ, Brian apparently muttered, forgetting he was on a recorded board call. What? Timothy Davis's voice crackled through from 30,000 feet somewhere over the Atlantic. Scott Anderson has never worked in a regulated industry, ever. He doesn't know that. Authorized official isn't just a title. It's a federal responsibility that requires background checks, professional references, compliance training, and notarized documentation submitted to FDA, DEA, EPA, and 3 state agencies. Timothy's voice got very quiet. How long do we have? 3 days. If we don't have complete verification documentation submitted by December 30th, our registration gets suspended pending a full compliance review. That's 90 to 180 days minimum. All trials stop. All compound development halts. We become a biotech company with no legal authority to work on biotechnology. More silence, the kind that ends careers and bankrupts companies. Finally, Timothy's voice came through the static. Where's Anderson now? Brian apparently checked the office system. He left at 6 p.m. His calendar shows he's at some digital transformation conference in Austin through Sunday. Get him back. Now. Already tried. His phone goes straight to voicemail. Then get Michael Thompson. Back. I don't think he'll take our calls. Timothy's voice cut through the conference line like a blade. He'll take our calls, but it's going to cost us everything Scott thought he was saving. Meanwhile, I was finishing my lighthouse puzzle and wondering if I should open another beer. My phone had been buzzing all evening. Missed calls from Brian, from Kevin, from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail, deleted the messages without listening to them. This wasn't my circus anymore. These weren't my monkeys. I was just a guy with 11 years of regulatory expertise, currently unemployed and enjoying the freedom that comes with watching other people's carefully constructed worlds collapse in real time. But I knew they'd be calling soon. Because when the federal government starts asking questions, you need someone who speaks the language. And Scott Anderson? He spoke fluent startup, but he didn't know the first word of federal bureaucracy. The regulatory storm had arrived. And Scott Anderson was standing in the middle of it, holding nothing but a stress ball and a business degree, while the professionals he'd dismissed as legacy overhead were the only ones who could navigate him out of the hurricane he'd created. The LinkedIn message came while I was replacing the air filter in my F-150 and pretending that the silence in my garage wasn't getting old. From Brian Richardson's assistant, "Hi Michael, hope you're doing well. Mr. Richardson would like to discuss a consulting opportunity when convenient. Just exploratory conversation." I stared at the message, wiping grease off my hands with an old Army t-shirt. I hadn't opened LinkedIn in weeks. The last thing I'd posted was a generic farewell that sounded more like an obituary than a career move. After 11 great years, moving on to new challenges, got 23 likes and 2 MLM recruitment pitches, and now here they were, wanting an exploratory conversation. I didn't reply. 6 hours later, the email arrived in my personal inbox. Formal and desperate, like a subpoena dressed up for Sunday dinner. Consulting engagement, time-sensitive, from Brian Richardson at Pharmatech Innovations. We'd like to discuss a short-term consulting arrangement regarding urgent regulatory developments. Please advise availability at your earliest convenience. Confidentiality appreciated. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just corporate desperation wrapped in legal language and tied with a bow made of pure panic. I chose Murphy's Diner on Highway 101, the kind of place where truckers stop for coffee and eggs, and nobody from Pharmatech would ever voluntarily eat. Too much real food, not enough organic kale. I wore my cleanest jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt, the uniform of a man with nothing to prove and everything to negotiate. Brian arrived looking like he'd been sleeping in his office for a week. His tie was crooked, his briefcase had coffee stains, and he moved like someone who'd spent the last 72 hours explaining disasters to people with law degrees and short tempers. He sat down across from me, no handshake, no small talk. I liked that, got straight to business. "Thanks for meeting," he started, voice hoarse. "We're in a situation." I pulled a single sheet of paper from my jacket and slid it across the Formica table. He looked down, read it, blinked twice. "This is your consulting rate?" "Weekly," I said, sipping coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. 4-week minimum, non-negotiable. I report directly to the board, not to legal, not to operations, and definitely not to anyone who thinks federal compliance is something you can optimize with an app. Brian read the number again. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "This is market rate for fixing disasters created by people who fire expertise and then beg it to come back," I finished. There's also equity, 0.4% vesting over 3 years. I want skin in the game for cleaning up the mess I was let go in the middle of. And Scott, complete termination of access to any system that touches federal agencies. I don't care if he runs the company bowling league, but he doesn't get within 3 folders of regulatory documentation. Brian nodded like a man who'd already made peace with reality. The board approved everything you're asking for. We don't have time to negotiate. Smart board. There's one more thing, Brian said, pulling out his phone. We need you back tomorrow. The FDA deadline is December 30th. That's 48 hours. I leaned back in the vinyl booth, fingers steepled. Doable. But I'm going to need Dr. Sarah Davis from MedTech Associates to coordinate the clinical trial documentation, and I want Jennifer Adams from Richardson Regulatory Consulting on retainer for the federal submission review. Done. And Scott Anderson? He's been reassigned to Strategic Business Development. Effective immediately. No regulatory access, no federal system credentials, no authority over anything that requires a government signature. I almost smiled. Almost. What did you tell him? That his innovative approach to regulatory transformation exceeded the current operational parameters of our federal compliance framework. Corporate speak for, "You're fired, but we're too scared of lawyers to use those words." Something like that. I stood up, dropped a 10 on the table for coffee I'd barely touched. I'll be there at 8 a.m. Have all the federal portal access restored, get me a complete audit of every outstanding filing, and tell the CEO I want a board presentation slot for next Friday. Michael, Brian said as I turned to leave, we should have listened to you. I looked back at him, this exhausted lawyer who was probably a decent guy caught in the middle of someone else's ego trip. You did listen. You just chose to listen to the loudest voice instead of the right one. Happens all the time. That's why guys like me have job security. Monday morning, the nameplate outside my new office read Michael Thompson, Chief Regulatory Officer. Not a cubicle, not a shared workspace, not even a senior director title, but an actual C-suite office with real walls, a door that locked, and direct reporting authority to the board of directors. I didn't redecorate. No motivational posters, no family photos, just my laptop, my restored federal access credentials, and a printout of our regulatory compliance status. Critical but recoverable, assuming nobody else decided to innovate our federal relationships. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in why institutional knowledge matters. I spent Tuesday morning on conference calls with FDA compliance officers who remembered my voice, DEA schedulers who'd worked with me for years, and EPA chemical reviewers who knew I didn't waste their time with incomplete submissions. By Tuesday evening, we had emergency verification documentation submitted to 6 federal agencies, emergency authorization letters notarized and uploaded, and emergency compliance affidavits signed by CEO Timothy Davis, who flew back from London specifically to put his signature on forms he didn't understand but knew better than to question. Wednesday morning brought confirmation emails from every federal agency. Verification documentation received and under expedited review. Registration status, provisional pending final approval. Thursday afternoon, FDA Drug Establishment registration. Status, approved. Authorized official, Michael Thompson, Chief Regulatory Officer. Friday morning, I had my board presentation. 5 slides, 10 minutes, 0 PowerPoint animations. Slide 1, current federal compliance status. Slide 2, regulatory risk assessment going forward. Slide 3, recommended organizational structure. Slide 4, budget requirements for sustained compliance. Slide 5, questions. The only question came from Jason Williams, the investor who'd threatened to pull funding can. You guarantee this won't happen again? I can guarantee that as long as regulatory decisions are made by people who understand regulation, and as long as federal compliance isn't treated like a legacy system that needs disrupting, this company will maintain its federal authorization to operate. And if someone decides regulatory affairs is overhead again, I looked around the conference table at faces that had learned some expensive lessons about the difference between innovation and expertise. Then you'll need to find another regulatory expert willing to clean up the mess. Good luck with that. That afternoon, I was back in my office, updating filing calendars and rebuilding the compliance tracking system that Scott Anderson had tried to replace with a project management app. My phone buzzed with a text from my son, Jake. Dad, saw your LinkedIn update. Chief Regulatory Officer. That's awesome. Proud of you. I texted back. Thanks, kiddo. Experience pays off eventually. And that's how I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just being right, being patient, and letting people discover for themselves the difference between disrupting an industry and destroying a company. Scott Anderson thought he could innovate his way around federal bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy had other ideas. I leaned back in my chair, looked out the window at Scott's empty parking space where his Tesla used to sit, and smiled. I didn't have to raise my voice, didn't have to threaten anyone, didn't have to do anything except change a name on a form and let the system teach everyone the lesson I'd been trying to tell them for 11 years. Sometimes the best teacher is consequences. And federal agencies, they're excellent teachers. In my 11 years of regulatory work and 8 years in the Army before that, I've learned that there's no app for experience, no startup that can disrupt decades of institutional knowledge, and no amount of buzzwords that can replace the quiet competence of someone who actually knows how the system works. The real lesson here isn't about revenge. It's about the fact that every industry has people like me, the ones who keep the lights on while others get the credit. And when you fire experience to hire enthusiasm, you better hope the federal government is feeling forgiving that week.